everyone. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to this Green Alliance event sponsored by Could have got the first sentence right. Welcome to this Green Alliance event sponsored by Zero Waste Scotland. My name is Ros Bullied, and I'm the Research Director at Green Alliance. Hopefully most of you will have heard of us, but if not, we're an ambitious independent think tank, an NGO advocating for environmental policies. We've been doing it for 40 years as well, so hopefully we've mostly learned what we're doing. We also convene the Greener UK Coalition of Environmental Groups and warm this winter grouping of environmental and fuel poverty campaigners. We provide the Secretariat for the Environment All-Party Parliamentary Group and run the Circular Economy Task Force and Business Circle of working with industry on both. People sometimes ask what my job and working at a think tank actually involves. Perhaps it's hard to shake the feeling that it involves fish tanks. So to avoid confusion about what I do all day, I help our incredibly smart policy team assess the gaps in environmental evidence and progress around policies, build a case and make recommendations as to where we could collectively improve things. That then feeds into the work of our equally clever political and comms teams who make sure those recommendations are heard far and wide. As we do that, we grapple with plenty of complexity. We also have to collaborate, and we try and be optimistic. We know what we're doing is enormously important, even before reminders like today's IPCC news. But we don't have to do the really hard final step. That's where we need the determination of politicians like those who will be on stage today. We need our politicians to be up for the challenge of delivering a greener economy and society as fast as they possibly can. And that's why this event this evening is all about political leadership for the environment. Ensuring we have a habitable planet for future generations is ultimately going to be a political choice. And we need that choice to be action. Public debate on the environment has come on immeasurably in the last 5 or 10 years. The fact that things like green growth and air quality are now part of the mainstream discussion is a huge step forward. But there's more still to do. Our policy tracker, released on Friday, showed that the UK still has considerable gaps to fill if it's to be on track for net zero at the end of this decade. And we're concerned it's not moving fast enough. The policies put in place since the start of the Parliament cover 87% of the reductions needed, but around half of those are high-level targets or things stuck in consultation stage. And we've had much more progress on climate than nature or pollution. Both of our speakers later have seen the link between better use of materials and climate change, but resource efficiency and circularity are often forgotten too. The US's recent adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act and reciprocal moves from the EU are validation of the economic sense that growing clean businesses makes. And good news for the planet as well. But they create new pressures on UK politicians to make sure we're not going to start losing out on a whole host of economic opportunities. As attention turns to the next election, this evening's event is hopefully a timely reminder that however good the ideas out there are, it is more important than ever to have the political figures willing to champion them, and on all sides of the debate. To guide you through the rest of the evening, I'm delighted to introduce you to Ione Wells. Ione is a political correspondent at BBC News. She reports for television and radio, among other things. She's broken a number of stories about the politics of implementing energy policy too, for instance, around how the government is discussing internally how to fund nuclear energy and reform planning rules. A great person to guide us through what I know will be a really interesting discussion. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Ros, and thanks everyone for coming tonight for what is going to be hopefully a fascinating discussion later on a topic that has never felt more relevant covering Westminster politics in the last 2 years. I think from a political correspondent's perspective, I've never seen political leaders' minds more focused on this issue than in the last year or so. Not only have we seen environmental and human tragedy from record temperatures, wildfires across the world, devastating floods in places like Pakistan, but the war in Ukraine crucially also really focused minds in Westminster on our vulnerability to energy price shocks, with energy bills skyrocketing from global gas prices. And I remember in about February last year hearing that phrase energy independence come up again and again and again before it was announced that the government was essentially going to have to introduce a strategy specifically on this issue. Now, among that too, there have been political challenges as well, internal debates in government about things like the cost of nuclear power, whether or not to liberalise our planning system to allow for all more onshore wind and solar energy, heated debate around fracking, which many of you may have followed last year as well, how much or not politicians might need to reckon with the public about changes that we might need to all expect in our lives if carbon targets are to be met, and debates around the ultra-low emission zones in London taking place at the moment. But there's also been lots of discussion about political opportunity too, all parties talking about green jobs and technology being key to growing the economy as well. So we're going to have a lively discussion, hopefully, in a minute from our two panellists, two of the most high-profile environmental leaders in elected office in the UK, Chris Skidmore MP and London Mayor Sadiq as well. But first, I'd just like to introduce Ian Gulland, who is founding chief executive of the sponsor of tonight's event, Zero Waste Scotland, to make a short speech.
Thank you very much, Ione. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be here. Really looking forward to the discussion and debate. But before I do hand over the floor to esteemed guests, I was asked to just say a few words about sort of reflections on leadership, and particularly in the context of our mission around net zero. And I guess that's my starting point, emphasising that this is our mission. It's a collective mission. It's a global mission. As a chief exec, I understand, well, you think I understand quite a bit about leadership as a chief exec. It's something I get up every morning to really aim to demonstrate effective leadership in the organisation. But also a big part of my job is to empower colleagues within the business to be leaders in their own right. And I know that leadership isn't just about good management. It's not just about setting targets, delivering in your own area of expertise and your own area of responsibility. Leadership is also about spanning the wider organisation, looking at the corporate goals perhaps, or the business goals, organisational goals, and seeking to influence the collective ambition of the organisation and leaning in to support others in the organisation and providing collaborative action. It's about having a different mindset. It's about seeing the bigger picture and understanding how all those various parts of an organisation fit together and how they need to cooperate to achieve the vision. In traditional models of leadership, it's about being comfortable sitting at the top of the T, people who understand the sort of T model of leadership, rather than being in the vertical, rather than being kind of focused on, as I say, your particular areas of influence. But I think when it comes to climate change, it's that's what we really need. We really need much more of leaders who are at the top, who are comfortable at the top of the T. And that's where it's much more acute, and that's where we need to really support and see those types of leaders, and how we can get more of those leaders, and how can we support the ones that are already there. For us, the recent circularity gap report that was produced by Circular Economy from the Netherlands, that looked at the kind of global picture in terms of the circular economy, highlighted that our global consumption of materials is over 100 million tonnes now annually, and it's rising. But the actual percentage of materials that we reuse or recycle or use again is just over 7%. So we're definitely going in the wrong direction. And the impact of all of that, I'm sure, is everybody in the room is well aware of the impact of that, not just on climate change, but biodiversity loss, water stress, and possibly more importantly, social inequality around the world. So the message is very clear that we can't do this. We can't close that gap one business at a time or one initiative at a time. We require a system-level recast of our economy where resources are optimised, growth is decoupled from consumption, collaboration is valued over competition, and the new economic indicators are able to monitor not only the health of our economy, but our resources, our people and our planet. But another important fact from the material flow analysis that everyone's doing is showing that our consumption is embedded in global trade and supply chains. So tackling this will require closer cooperation and partnership, not just with our own communities, but with nations and communities around the world and cities. So if I could just make one call today, one call for action, It's for the leadership which sees the advantage of being more than the sum of our parts. This isn't a race any one region or country can win on its own. This is a race humanity needs to win together. And I was reminded of that when I was at COP26 a few years ago in Glasgow. And what I saw, particularly when I looked at cities, I was on the stage with a number of different cities, not just at UK level, but across the world, speaking about action that people were taking. I started to see a kind of awakening from the cities, not just realising the important role that cities have in driving the change that we all require and supporting each other in that, but actually how they could work together as collective action. They could step out of their more, to some extent, insular role, thinking about what they're doing in their independent localities, but how they could actually start to change corporate approaches, how they could change supply chains, how they could affect real behaviour change at scale, not just here in the UK, but globally. How they could facilitate that. So this is an opportunity for leadership, leaders that we are going to listen to. How can they help facilitate? How can they connect, start dialogues and provide the infrastructure needed for the new alternative business models, the new dialogue and governance structures that we will need to enable the shift of a new economic model which is much more circular and more equal, both here at home, but more importantly, around the world. And finally, I don't think something that I was drummed into me in my career and something I always share with colleagues in my business, that the thing about leadership, great leadership, it's also not waiting to be asked. Great leaders just get on and do it. Thank you.
Zero Waste Scotland. I want to introduce our first speaker. Hon Chris Skidmore is a Conservative MP who authored the government's Net Zero Review and chairs Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on the environment. He served across multiple departments in government, including being the interim Energy and Climate Change Minister in 2019, where he signed the UK commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions into law by 2050 and secured the UK's presidency of the COP26 summit as well. So Chris, great to hear from you.
Thank you, Ione, and thank you very much to the Green Alliance for hosting this important event tonight. For those of you who aren't aware, the Green Alliance also provides the Secretariat for the cross-party, all-party group on the environment, which I currently chair. And that group is incredibly important for ensuring Conservatives like myself can work shoulder to shoulder with Caroline Lucas, with a number of MPs from all different political parties, and really recognise that when it comes to climate, the issue is too urgent and too pressing to play partisan party politics with. And that was clearly a message for the Net Zero Review, which I chaired, and we published our report, Mission Zero, in January. That we need that long-term stability, not just when it comes to investment and future direction, but policy stability also. And we need to return to that consensus that was in place, after all, when we took forward the Climate Change Act, a fantastic piece of Labour legislation that was backed by the Conservative Party, and Greg Clark at the time pushed Labour to go further, to get from a 60% emissions reduction target to an 80% emissions reduction target. And when, as Ione said, I was the Energy Minister responsible for signing net zero into law back in 2019, we were able then to take that target from 80% to 100%, effectively delivering on the UK's commitment to become the first G7 country to sign net zero into law, beating France by one single day, and demonstrating that UK, that really important international leadership that now allowed me effectively to secure COP26 on the back of a series of bilateral phone conversations with ministers. If we hadn't done net zero, it's in doubt whether we would have necessarily got COP26. But it was obviously that consensus we had in Parliament. And there was an opportunity for those who wished to vote against net zero to do so. They didn't take it, but it was a parliamentary debate that we had. And if you'd asked me, back in 2019, that having taken this thing forwards, that 3.5 years on, 90% of the world's GDP would be under a net zero target of some form, I simply wouldn't have believed you. And it demonstrates the opportunity that leadership can bring if you are willing to lead. And when it comes to the Net Zero Review and Mission Zero, we are clear that the UK still has an opportunity to lead when it comes to tackling climate change. But like so many other countries, and the IPCC report demonstrates today, that window for leadership is closing. But the UK risks becoming a follower. And with becoming a follower instead of becoming a leader, risks also damaging not just your international reputation, but your economic reputation as well. And we now know that net zero is the economic opportunity of the future. It's not just an environmental policy tool. We have the opportunity to tackle the climate crisis, but also to grow our economy for the future. And Joe Biden has demonstrated clear leadership in showing that every second job is a green job. And we shouldn't necessarily shy away from that. But in many respects, I feel like a bit of an imposter coming here, to be honest with you. And it's an honour to act as the warm-up act for the mayor. Because a year ago, I was in a very different place. I was sort of, a backbencher. I'd been out of government since February 2020. And I thought that was potentially sort of my political career sort of over. And it wasn't until I think I turned on to, maybe it was the BBC, or I saw Helena Horton in the audience today, and I read maybe an article online with The Guardian that said Tory MPs sort of rowing back on net zero. And there'd been the creation of this new net zero scrutiny group. And I thought, not in my name am I willing to allow my identity as a Tory MP to be seen to be somehow rowing back on net zero. So I just took the sort of knee-jerk response thing. I go on Twitter, I said, I'm setting up a new net zero support group. And I just tweeted it. And as these things are like with Twitter, suddenly the ticks, the retweets start counting up. I got a call from the BBC PM programme, will you come on? And then I had Kathy Newman from Channel 4, will you come on Channel 4 to talk about this? And suddenly, before I knew it, I was sort of leading a new coalition of Conservative MPs demonstrating that actually there are Conservatives who are absolutely supportive of net zero. And then I had the opportunity to take over the all-party group on the environment, which I've done with relish. And then there was that leadership contest. And I sort of felt, well, sometimes in life you've got nothing to lose. And for all the NGOs in the audience, I think this is an important message for you to take away as well. There's no reward without risk. So sometimes you're worried about, are you going to offend the government? Are they going to stop funding like a particular project that you're involved in? Sometimes you've got to be able to take that risk. And I thought, well, actually, what have I got to lose? So instead of like backing a candidate straight away, I thought, you know what, I'm going to back net zero. And I organised a leadership hustings where I tried to hold all leadership candidates' feet to the fire. I created a Conservative environment pledge. Almost all the candidates then sort of signed it, apart from one who's now the Home Secretary and the other one who's now the Business and Trade Secretary. But that aside, Liz Truss, I'm going to be honest with you, I sort of shredded my own political credibility on the sake of net zero, because once I realised that Liz Truss was going to win, I thought, well, I've got to be able to own the policy. So I defected from Rishi Sunak. I wasn't particularly impressed with the fact that he talked about a moratorium again on onshore wind, which was the last thing that I thought I'd back someone for. So I switched camps and went to Liz Truss, and she said, well, will you lead this independent review on net zero for me? And I wasn't quite sure where it was going. I'm sure all of you were slightly worried, thinking, what's this review of net zero? Are the Tories going to scrap net zero? I mean, obviously, that was the last thing that I was going to do. It was my last chance, I felt, in government to be able to sort of come back and mark my homework. Obviously, the net zero strategy had been declared illegal in the courts. I wasn't involved in that. I was out of government at the time, but I was able to come back and almost mark my homework. And I thought I'd just throw everything at it. And what I thought was really important, I think this is also, we're coming together. It wasn't my review. It was your review. I said to every sector, tell me what are the barriers that are holding you back. Tell me what are the opportunities you want to see achieved in the future. And let's co-create and co-own this process and demonstrate to government what is needed to happen. And obviously the Green Alliance's report this week has also demonstrated what is needed to happen. The IPCC report this week today has also demonstrated what is needed to happen for the future. And all that is about not just what the government can do, but what cities like London can do, Manchester, Glasgow. Actually, we've got to be able to give people greater authority and responsibility to get on their own net zero journeys. And that's the fantastic thing about net zero, is everyone can be net zero if they so choose to wish and demonstrate their own personal leadership towards this, their own corporate leadership towards this, their own charitable leadership towards this, their own political leadership towards this mission. And it is a mission, which is why it's Mission Zero in the report. And I'll just finish again on that risk versus reward, because sometimes in life, you've got to think, where do you stand? And for me, again, if you'd asked me this a year ago, I'm not sure I would have been able to give you an honest answer, but it came down to a question of me having to vote in a confidence motion on my own government on fracking. And I remember at the time that I thought, this is a moment where I either demonstrate that I put my money where my mouth is. And it came to a point that I felt that I cared more about conserving our planet than I did about conservatism. And while I still remain a Conservative MP, obviously I'm standing down at the next election, my seat's being abolished, it's not like I'm standing down from it. I've decided now that my next career will be about focusing on net zero and the environment. But net zero was not an inevitability. I've just interviewed Farhana Yamin, who is a London sort of lawyer who's responsible. Her story's not told enough. She effectively created net zero. And very few people were willing to back net zero when it first arrived. People were beginning to understand what we needed to do about 1.5 degrees. But she and a group of women called the Lionesses, Christiana Figueres, Rachel Kite, pushed this onto the agenda. So let's not forget there will be other policy frameworks that we need to push forward. We need to demonstrate leadership for the future. ULIS, for example, that is a policy initiative that we need in order to demonstrate how we're going to save the lives of Londoners and their children and allowing people to grow up in safe, pollutant-free environments. But it's no different from the congestion charge. It's no different from the early stage of ULEZ. People may complain, people may oppose, but eventually you win the argument. You listen to their concerns, you take them on board. I actually met with the Net Zero Scrutiny Group during the review process. The BBC wrote it up saying, you've met with the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, but it's really important to meet and recognise that you've got to build consensus, not just amongst ourselves in the room, but also amongst your opponents. And understanding their fears and concerns as well, not necessarily always agreeing with those fears and concerns, but working with them is also a really important part of leadership that demonstrates also the humility in ensuring that we put politics into practice. Thank you very much.
And we'll expand on some of those points around leadership and cross-party working as well in the discussion. But first to welcome our second speaker to give his speech. Sadiq Khan has been Mayor of London since 2016 and was previously the Labour MP for Tooting and Minister in multiple departments as well. As Mayor, he has called air pollution the biggest public health emergency of a generation and has set London a target to be net zero by 2030. So Sadiq, please welcome.
Well, good evening. It's fantastic to join you all tonight. Can I begin by thanking Ione for that introduction and for chairing these proceedings. Don't worry, Ione, as a rising star of the BBC, I'm not going to ask you where you stood on the Gary Lineker side. Let's just say, if you wink one, you supported him. If you wink twice, you supported him. And I only just blinked, so I'm not sure what that means. But look, can I just begin by paying tribute to the Green Alliance, not only for hosting this important event, but for the vital work you're doing to secure a greener future. Let's please show appreciation by a round of applause to Green Alliance. I also want to say a few words about Chris Skidmore. Yes, we are from different political parties, but Chris's excellent work to champion and protect the UK government's net zero commitment deserves to be acknowledged and praised. I'm proud to be sharing a platform with Chris. Let's please show Chris our appreciation as well. I've got to confess, though, I hadn't realised that Chris had backed Liz, which makes me nervous, bearing in mind he's now backing me. We're all here this evening because, like Chris, we share a passion for achieving a greener world. It can be a difficult and draining pursuit at times. We've all seen in recent years how climate action taken by national governments around the world has been modest at best. But despite this, I remain optimistic. And a big part of my optimism stems from the potential of our cities. Yes, cities are responsible for more than 70% of global carbon emissions. But 3/4 of cities are also decreasing their per capita emissions at a faster rate than their own countries. This means that collectively, if we all step up, we can make a huge difference in this fight. In London, I've been striving to set an example, to be a doer, not a delayer, when it comes to climate action. And I'm proud of what we've delivered since 2016. We've rolled out the largest electric bus fleet and largest electric vehicle charging network in Western Europe. We've delivered a 5-fold increase in protected cycling lanes. We've invested record amounts in green jobs, skills and infrastructure as part of our Green New Deal. We've committed, as you've heard, London to being net zero by 2030, faster than any comparable city and with a plan of how we get there. And just today, on World Rewilding Day, we've committed a further £1 million to rewilding our city, including a new competition to reintroduce London's lost species, starting with bringing back bats in Barnes, bees in Bexley, and yes, beavers in Ealing. And you know, the world's finest green brains chose the names of the first 2 beavers, Justin Beaver and Sigourney Beaver. But this evening I want to talk about something that imperils all this progress, something that could not only halt further action in London, but in other cities around the world too. And that's the concerted and seemingly well-funded, orchestrated campaign against the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone. Back in 2016, and then again in 2021, I promised you that I'd be the greenest mayor ever. It's right that you continue to hold me to this. It's right that green think tanks and campaign groups are not satisfied with what already has been done. Because given the urgency of the climate crisis, you want more. You listen to the list of green achievements, some of which I've mentioned a moment ago, and your first instinct is, okay, but what's next? And I respect that. But I want to turn the tables this evening by lobbying you for something. The causes of climate change and air pollution are the same. If you reduce air pollution, you also reduce carbon emissions. Improving air quality and tackling the climate emergency go hand in hand. So I need your help to make the case for clean air and the ULEZ expansion, because we can't afford to look ahead to the next challenge when we're still very much locked in the heat of a defining battle. The ULEZ has been transformational so far. It's been one of the most successful environmental initiatives anywhere in the world. It's already led to a reduction of 800,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, the equivalent of over 2.5 billion kilometres driven by petrol cars. It's helped to cut one of the most harmful pollutants by nearly half in central London, and it saved lives in our city, protecting the lungs of our children, parents and grandparents. But despite the overwhelming evidence of the benefits, there's a sustained campaign of opposition. Of course, there are some Londoners with genuine concerns about the ULEZ. They're worried about what it could mean for them, particularly during this cost of living crisis. As Mayor, I'll always listen and address concerns and provide further support where necessary. That's why I launched the biggest ever scrapper scheme in London to support low-income Londoners, small businesses, charities and disabled Londoners. But there are clearly some people who have latched on to the ULEZ to push their own agenda. This includes a relatively small but well-organised group of climate deniers and vested interests who are playing on the genuine concerns of Londoners because they sense an opportunity to put a dent in the drive towards greater climate action. Sadly, we're seeing some of the same damaging political tactics that have become prevalent over recent years to divide and mislead. The dismissal of science, the suggestion that experts can just be ignored, and the peddling of misinformation. I'm quite clear in my mind. We can't allow false narratives to take hold, because if these climate delayers were to win, the message it would send out to other politicians and governments around the world is that bold climate action is simply not worth it. It's not possible, not politically achievable. Look, right now, London is a beacon for climate action. Other cities look to us for leadership. So, if we were to fail to successfully deliver the ULEZ expansion, the ripple effect would be huge. Why would other politicians pursue bold green policies? Climate deniers and delayers would be emboldened, and our climate movement and supporters would be put on the back foot. So let me finish with this. The reasons I've decided to expand the ULEZ now is simple. I know in my heart, and the evidence tells us, that this is the right thing to do. As Chris said, no reward without risk. I'm not willing to kick the can down the road for the sake of my own political fortunes, like national leaders here and around the world have too often done. I know we're on the right side of history, that in time we'll be vindicated, just as those who took tough action against the smogs and tobacco were. But I need your help now, because make no mistake, ULEZ expansion has become one of the key frontiers in the fight for climate action. And winning the hearts and minds of millions of Londoners on this is crucial. So let's work together to ensure the long-term health of people and our planet triumphs over the short-term politics. Please give this the focus and the attention it deserves. Please don't assume we've already won the argument. Please help us to continue inspiring other cities around the world, galvanising the support of all those who desperately want to see meaningful action on air pollution and the climate emergency. Today's IPCC report is yet another stark reminder of how we don't have a minute to waste. You know, Barack Obama once said that change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. And this is the approach I'm taking. And I ask you to join me in doing the same so we can be that change. Thank you.
We've got now a bit of time to discuss some of the themes that both of our speakers have raised this evening, as well as a few submitted audience questions as well. Chris, first to you, you talked about a window of opportunity for leadership. Do you think that the government is showing enough urgency when it comes to net zero? It's not one of Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities, should it be?
Well, I won't deny that I wasn't disappointed when that sort of 5 priorities popped up and climate change and taking an opportunity of setting out a green industrial strategy wasn't there. I think the UK has traditionally been a leader in this regard, and with the Environmental Inflation Reduction Act, with the EU's EU Green Deal and the Fit 55, we now, as my review sets out, face a real risk of falling behind in the net zero race that has been created. So obviously the government's going to be responding to my review, I think at the end of the month, and we now have effectively 10 days to find out what will this government's appetite be? Are we strategically going to position ourselves to maintain leadership? Or are we going to cede that leadership to another? And I'm actually genuinely nervous about it, because obviously I'm not even in government, but even if then the government decides later on to change its mind, there are market decisions now resting. I mean, already companies are relocating to the States, jobs are going over to the States. If the government doesn't set out a clear strategic pathway by the end of this month, then we will continue to miss out.
I'm interested in both your thoughts, actually, of how the UK should respond to that Inflation Reduction Act, particularly because there's a big focus in it on local areas and different subsidies being granted. And I wondered, Sadiq, as well, firstly, how you think the UK should be responding to that, but also what conversations you've had with the Labour Party's leadership about how they would support local leaders like yourself to deliver on net zero were they to be in government as well.
Yes, just to remind ourselves, and Chris touched upon this, the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is, frankly speaking, amazing. But it's a challenge to us, it's a challenge to the EU in relation to the flight of jobs and businesses to the USA because of the incentives he's given to the green economy. I mean, this isn't the place for knocking about politics, but the environment and zero carbon is in Keir Starmer's 5 missions, I'm pleased to say. And look, Ed Miliband, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves understand, it's the point Chris touched upon in his remarks, green growth, good growth is incredibly important. It's flipping the risk and the threat of climate change into an opportunity. That's what Biden's done, basically speaking. Every other job being a green job, as Chris touched on. And actually, if you think about it, we've talked about in other fora the importance of retrofitting our homes and our businesses. Well, actually, that's the opportunity to create jobs. Who's going to do the installation? Who's going to put the triple glazing in? Who's going to put the solar panels on? Who's going to build the solar panels? Who's going to build the turbines and so forth? And I think there's an opportunity there, and I'm really pleased. This is a serious point that the zero carbon objective, addressing the issue of climate emergency, is one of the 5 missions Keir announced. We'll be developing that more over the course of the next few weeks and months. We've also got to, by the way, use that as an opportunity to persuade those people Chris and I have talked about, those who are concerned for legitimate reasons why this is an opportunity, what in the jargon called just transition, the strategy scheme that I've announced and other things. So that's why reassuring people there are opportunities here. There is a first mover advantage, which is really important. We've always talked about an environmental crisis. I've been talking about a health crisis, but actually we can flip this on its head, and rather than being an economic crisis as well, be an economic opportunity.
This is really interesting. And just briefly for those in the room who may not know, although I'm sure lots of you do, the Inflation Reduction Act we're talking about is the huge programme of subsidies that President Biden has announced for green technology and investment. But as we've touched upon, there is extra tax relief there for projects in low-income and jobs areas, which comes on to this point of what I suppose is both of your response to some of those, some in your party, Chris, as well, who have claimed that some net zero policies are in conflict with levelling up and the kind of notion of addressing inequality, given particularly some of the big costs of things like nuclear energy, investing in green technology. How do you both respond to some of that opposition that you're facing that you've talked about?
Well, I think Chris coming himself talking, but I think Chris talked about this, and I've tried to do this, which is you've got to listen to the concerns people have and try to address them, right? But if you look at the history of our country in the last 200 years, from moving to cottage industries to using, inverted commas, the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, the factories, we've benefited to the cost of the planet of first mover. And I think a lot of this stuff takes investment, upfront investment at first. Some people call it a loss leader. But I think you've got to invest. The alternative is, buying this stuff in a few years' time from people overseas. Who's going to build the wind turbines? Who's going to build the solar panels? Who's going to have the skills to build the electric cars, the charging points, and so forth? And so we've got to explain to our colleagues that actually some of the industries that your constituents work in are time limited. And it's in your interest to invest now. One of the things that President Biden is doing very well, and actually Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor, is helping in some cities, is reskilling people up. If you've got skills in this industry, we're going to skill you up for skills in this industry. In America, big car manufacturing in cities like Detroit, a dying a death, and how you can train them up. And we've got to do the same in our country, because what is our future post-Brexit? Is it a low-skilled, low-regulation Singapore or Thames for London, or is it a high-skilled green economy making future-proof jobs that you can export goods and services? Chris talked about the stock exchange, but actually, look, we're concerned about people leaving the London Stock Exchange going to the New York Stock Exchange. If we were to have the greenest listing in the world, that's an opportunity. People want to list here. We don't talk about the green pound.
And Chris, what do you make of this as well? I mean, I've heard, for example, some in the Conservative Party talk about the Inflation Reduction Act as being not very conservative. Do you think there is a Conservative argument for it that could be made?
Well, I think when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, the Conservative point around the actual legislation is not the protectionism element of it, which obviously is like horse trading happens in any different country, and anyone who thinks that somehow the WTO are going to step in the next year or two to sort this out is for the birds. I mean, the money's going to be spent. I mean, I think the UK should get into the slipstream of the Inflation Reduction Act and work out how we can create a comparative advantage, not just in new technologies, but where we still are world leaders. And I know we're talking about the risks to the UK's leadership here, and obviously that was the format for why I took the review forwards, but we've also got to lean into what we're good at. And actually we've got huge opportunities still when it comes to regulatory standards, our services industry, the City of London, to be able to demonstrate clear global leadership. And as Sadiq said, when we speak, the rest of the world sits up and listens. And actually, I've met with John Kerry, Jennifer Morgan, all these people wanting to come and see me to discuss the net zero review, because they're all keen to understand. They've got their own NDC, National Determined Contributions, and they want to know how they're going to beat it. Climate commitments are just words on a page unless you're willing to take clear, bold action. And we're now in that stage where delivery works for us, and we're beginning to think about that for the future. So I would say when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, we've got to recognise the stability it provides. It's not just about the money as well. Those tax credits are guaranteed to the 1st of January 2033. And so sort of providing that stable pathway is exactly what business is crying out for. And if you're a Conservative, overwhelmingly you're meant to be on the side of business, and you should be listening to business, and if business is telling you they need stability, continuity, certainty and clarity, the 4 C's that we set out as being clear requirements of setting out a framework for emissions zero, the report I did, then we should listen to business.
And as you both touched on, 2022 saw a massive pushback against net zero from certain quarters, the net zero scrutiny group that Chris talked about, some calling for a return to fracking, which Chris, you talked about, you're rebelling against that, many pushing back against the idea of more onshore wind turbines. Do you think that party management, particularly with the polls where they are for the Conservatives at the moment, is getting in the way of passing what some would argue are the bold policies that are needed to tackle some of these issues?
So I personally, passionately believe I think there's a disjoint between Westminster being afraid of its own shadow and in comparison to actually what's happening on the ground in communities, in cities across the country. People want to take action. And actually, when you look at the polls, action on climate change and on the environment is number 3 behind the NHS and the economy. So to somehow suggest that going green is going to cost you votes is ridiculous. Ben Houchen, Conservative Mayor for Teesside, got elected on a net zero ticket. I got elected back in 2019 with net zero being front page of the Conservative manifesto. So let's not forget that it does win votes, and people will be voting with their feet depending on which party is setting out a positive vision for change that puts the green agenda at the top of this.
Can I say, my views, it depends how you talk about this. If you call this stuff green crap, it doesn't work on the doorstep, right? It places the prejudice stereotype. If you explain, listen, the reason why we're so affected by Putin's invasion of Ukraine is because we're not energy secure. If we were to be energy secure, we would have a massive spike when there are these events taking place around the world. That's why we should be invested in renewables and solar, so we're energy secure as a response to the doorstep. If somebody on the doorstep complains about the energy bills going up, and you say, actually, the reason why energy bills have gone up is because we import the stuff from the Middle East and gas from Russia and so forth. But actually, by investing in solar and wind, we wouldn't have to invest so much. So your bills will go up so much. By the way, the reason why your bills are high is because your house is really inefficient. You've got no insulation, no double glazing. So actually, the green agenda means we invest in your home, become insulated, and your double glazing being installed. If somebody complains about young Johnny, young Josephine can't get a job because the car factory closed down, and you explain, well, actually, you know what? Because of the retrofit revolution from the Mayor of London, we're scaling up people in the green academies to be installers, retrofitters, fixed electrical charging points. And so Chris is right to an extent in relation to you can turn the argument around, but politicians are very poor at addressing people's concerns by explaining that this green crap actually is our future and can address the challenges you have today. Your daughter, nephew, regularly going to the local A&E because of an asthma attack. It's because this invisible killer you can't see. And so the US helps you address that because it's cleaning up the air in our city and so forth. So I think we've got to be far more innovative as politicians to do that. I see my sideline, Fleur Anderson is the MP for Putney. When I first became the mayor, Putney, in the first 4 days of the year, by January the 4th, and the only as well, the assembly member for Wanston Merton, in the first 4 days of the year in Putney, they have the annual pollution limits reached by January the 4th in Putney High Street, because of the diesel buses and the diesel lorries. By January the 4th, the year's quota has been done. Because of the ULEZ, because we've made every single bus ULEZ compliant, Putney High Street now has lawful legal limits. So it means it gives Fleur Anderson MP the confidence to be pro-ULEZ. It gives Leonie Cooper the confidence to talk about pro-green agendas. And that's why you've got to flip it on its head. Mette Coburn's head, the environmental lead in Hackney. More people in Hackney on a bicycle than any borough in the country because they've got green credentials, and they flipped it on the head. And that's why we've got to be confident, make it cross-party, and address people's concerns by explaining this is an opportunity, not a threat.
It's really interesting, your point about cross-party, because you've both talked about convincing the public and what type of language is needed for that. But I'm interested too in your thoughts on how do you convince your political colleagues who are going to make these decisions. At the moment, we know some of these solutions may take longer than 5-year election cycles, and yet the way that our system works means that sometimes perhaps competition is put before collaboration. So how do you build that cross-party consensus in politics, not just among the public as well?
So, I think I talked about the Climate Change Act, and I do feel that obviously having that in primary legislation makes it very difficult for any sort of new administration to come in and rip it out without a manifesto commitment to say, we're going to abolish the Climate Change Act. So I think we have a well-regarded, stable system in place that other countries deeply admire and respect. But obviously building future support for future policy change, it must, I think, look at the common currency. I think Sadiq's absolutely right. So it's not just about green jobs, it's about they're engineering jobs, they're retrofitting jobs. Some people see that opportunity, it can be sold to them. But it's not just about using the sort of traditional currency of jobs, I think, that we've got to recognise here. We've missed out on opportunities already. When people talk about, look at the electric battery factory that Ford was going to set up and now they're setting up in the States. That's our fault. We didn't invest in a gigafactory in time, and we've got to be able to challenge, as Sadiq said, the disinformation, the misinformation that's willfully put out there sometimes. That's just part and parcel of living in the modern world of politics, and social media encourages this. The most ridiculous thing I find is that we get some people now in their early 20s saying, remember that time when the climate sort of policy people warned us about acid rain and it never happened. I think the fact that we took action on the ozone layer, Margaret Thatcher took action on the ozone layer with Ronald Reagan in the Montreal Protocol, should be a clear demonstration that this isn't all about doom and gloom, that we can take action. We've got the tools to be able to take action now, and we can deliver on change. But it has to be cross-party, because we've got to be able to make sure that if we go too far to the right, too far to the left, you create that ability by another party to then look to campaign against a party on something that we should all embrace as being for our future, our common future.
I think you should always be suspicious about a politician who makes a promise to be delivered for a time where he or she's not going to be around. I'm always nervous about presidents and prime ministers who talk about getting to zero carbon by 2060, 2070, 2050, 2040, even 2030. I'll still be around. And so the beauty of President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is he's walking the walk now. So you can see the route map to getting zero carbon. One of the reasons, an amazing stat I discovered last year, of all the countries who signed the Paris Declaration, how many countries are on schedule to get to the zero carbon they promised? Of all the countries, 200 plus, answer 1, all right? There are 97 megacities who are part of what's called C40, the global city network. So one country is on course to meet Paris Agreement, one country. Of the 97 cities, members of C40 are on the chair, more than 2/3 of cities are on course to not just meet Paris, but exceed it. It's the point I made in the speech, we're doers, not delayers, because we work in 4-year cycles, we're close to our citizens, and we've got to deliver now because our citizens want action, because we spent time educating them, and they're pushing us to do more. And so that's the point I'd make in relation to action now, rather than kicking the can down the road. By the way, I could very easily have announced ULEZ expansion in 4 years' time, right? Because there's no sense of immediacy, so people out of London vote for it. There's 5 million people in outer London, 5 million people living out of London. The 10 boroughs with the highest death rates are in outer London. And we've seen cleaner air in central London and in London. Well, I think clean air is a human right, not a privilege. And that's why you've got to move now, rather than doing the politically expedient thing and kicking the can down the road. And that's why people like Chris and I need your help. It's going to be cross-party. So if one of the people loses, one of the party loses, the other party carries on with the agenda. Hopefully they won't lose. But the point being is you're going to try and make cross-party, and that's why the role of the Green Alliance is so important.
And I know we've got some questions from the floor, but wanted to ask you both briefly about local leadership as well. Chris, you've called for a sort of net zero local big bang. What does that mean for elected mayors like Sadiq, but also for devolved governments? I know we might have some representatives from local councils here in the room as well. And Sadiq as well, you've talked about your net zero target for 2030. Are you on track, do you think? And what else does London need to do to adapt to climate change when, again, the last year we did see flash flooding, we saw record temperatures in London. Is there more infrastructure? Does the transport system need to do more to adapt to some of those challenges that we've seen?
So that's right. The local Big Bang was one of the 10-year missions that we set out in the Net Zero Review, and that's very much about recognising we need a place-based approach to net zero. We're not going to achieve it, as Sadiq says, if we just trust the presidents and prime ministers of this world. But actually many cities in the UK want to go further, faster. Manchester with the 2038 target, Glasgow sort of 2045, and we should give them the freedom and the responsibility to be able to deliver on that, make them the authors of their own net zero journey, but also make sure that they are accountable for this. At the moment, we don't really, as a government, haven't prepared regions that are able to go further and faster with the ability to do so. So I'm actually a big believer in net zero devolution. I think that regional governments have an opportunity to then bring in crowd in private capital and place-based approaches. Let them get on with the job. But let's also recognise that we need to reform the planning system that is archaic, out of date, it's not fit for purpose of delivering on net zero. The National Policy Planning Framework has not just to be revised, it needs to be replaced with something that is net zero compliant. That coal mine in Cumbria would not be given the approval by the planning inspector if there was a net zero test in place, and that's the reality of what we need to achieve as a government. Let's get the regulation, let's get the legislation, let's get the funding in place, not so it's competitive funding, because we're going to have to do this anyway. So why are we allowing local authorities to bid competitively for this stuff, giving them 2 weeks notice and saying you've got to spend it all in a year? That's just not practical. Let's get the opportunity right, and once we've got the opportunities right, central government should get out of the way. And I believe that is also quite a Conservative mission.
Okay, I've never agreed more with the Tory. Somebody will take my pulse afterwards. But it's just inspiring to listen to Chris. So if we were speaking 5 years ago about climate change with a reasonably well-educated audience, we would think climate change is for others to worry about, the global south, and to worry about tomorrow. Climate change should worry us now. The chicks come home now. And as I only said, we had temperatures north of 40 degrees last summer. We had flash flooding the summer before, 2 months worth of rain in 2 hours. We've had the Thames Barrier used more in the last 5 years than the previous 25 years. Hottest temperature since records began have been in the last 20 years. And so we've got to recognise this is an issue that affects us and now. But also, just like on a global macro scale, those least responsible suffer the worst consequences, brackets global south. In our country, those least responsible suffer the worst consequences. Only half of Londoners own a car. Only half of London households own a car. Those least likely to own a car suffer the worst consequences from air pollution. So it's an issue of social justice. By the way, black, Asian, minority ethnic Londoners who are least likely to own a car suffer the worst consequences of air pollution because of where they live, by main roads and by places where there's lots of emissions being put out, which is carbon, particulate matter, and nitrogen dioxide. So the time of action is now. It was yesterday, but the next best thing is now. So we've got to adapt, make our city resilient. By 2030, roughly speaking, a quarter of our underground will be regularly flooded. 200,000 homes will be regularly flooded. So we've got to plant more trees, more canopy, and it's really important we don't think we can kick the can down the road. Every year in our city, Imperial College estimate around 4,000 deaths prematurely every year. There are children with stunted lungs now, adults with a whole host of health issues now, asthma, cancer, heart disease, lung disease, dementia. So the time for dither and delay is gone. We've got to do action now.
A brief, quick fire, I think, from both of you then. What is the policy you'd like to see central government enact right now? And then we'll go to just some quick questions from the floor.
Really quickly, I think there's a whole host of recommendations in the Review 129. We'll hear from the government very shortly what they're going to take forwards. But I think the ones I really need to see in place are ones around delivery, infrastructure and grid. And for me, that would be creating an office for net zero delivery that would hold all departments to account, and also a net zero duty on Ofgem, because at the moment we simply have our hands tied behind our back when it comes to actually building out the infrastructure we need.
My one is, there are lots of Chris's recommendations on local and regional. I agree fully. The biggest thing the government could do is devolve powers and resources to cities and regions. So we in City Hall are responsible for about a third of carbon emissions. If I did everything I could possibly do, everything, 100% of what I can do, is still only a third of carbon emissions being reduced. The other 2/3, I haven't got the powers or the resources, so that's the most important thing they could do. Not just me, Andy Burnham, Andy Street, Ben Houchin, Tracy Braben, other mayors and regions around the country. They're the powers and resources that can do some really exciting things.
Thank you both. Just so we've got time, there's 3 questions which have been submitted from our audience for both of you. From Libby Peake, Head of Resource Policy at Green Alliance, Leonie Cooper, who is the Labour London Assembly member, and Jess Smith from the WWF. I think we're going to take all 3 questions at once, and then if you could both answer, that would be brilliant.
The questions are the hard ones, I'm the easy ones.
Yes.
Thanks very much. I'm Leonie Cooper, one of the London Assembly members. I sit on the cross-party Environment Committee, where we mostly work very well together. I wanted to ask something about communication and messaging, and I wanted to ask something specific about the ULEZ. A lot of the messaging has obviously been around health, which is absolutely right. Should we be putting more messaging into the communication around ULEZ that ties it more explicitly together with addressing the climate emergency, because it clearly addresses both? And a more general question, and one for Green Alliance and one for all of us, is just generally about the language associated with this whole area: extended producer responsibility, circularity, circular economy, net zero itself, just transition. These are all words that we might be terribly familiar with, but I think they can create a barrier, and then into that space you do find this misinformation and disinformation. What more can we all do, and what would you recommend as leading politicians in this area to improve our communication of sometimes quite complicated subjects? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Libby Peake from Green Alliance. I just wanted to come back to something that Ian was talking about earlier in the evening. The UN has been quite clear that extracting and processing resources causes 50% of climate emissions around the world and 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress. And actually, Green Alliance research has shown that if you view resource use as a climate policy, you could deliver much greater savings than a lot of the climate policies that have been enacted so far. So I want to commend both the speakers, first of all, for noticing the link and for attempting to drive a more circular economy. I really use that phrase, we know what it is. But but note that you're quite unique amongst political leaders in making that link. And so to ask you what you think needs to be done to bring more political leaders along in recognising that, and what we should be doing at both the city and national level to deliver change.
Hello, I'm Ross from the Leader Rep. I just thought I'd ask a quick question from the nature angle. So the Net Zero Review and today's announcement about bringing back EVAs in London include welcome recognition that's tackling the climate emergency and the nature emergency, the two sides of the same coin. But the approach to nature restoration across the country is often a piecemeal and doesn't address the biggest drivers of environmental harm, what we consume and how we reduce it. How can local and national government work with producers, with retailers, with NGOs to increase ambition on the triple challenge we face of tackling climate change, restoring nature and growing healthy, sustainable food?
Thank you. If we address Ione's questions first about language and ULEZ as well.
Sure. So thanks for your question. I thought you were a friend. But it really makes a really important point, which is, I've now stopped carrying my green dictionary because I've got the jargon, but it's really complicated. I mean, just transition, circular economy, all that sort of stuff. And so, I thought about the question at you. What language do you think we should use in relation to those sorts of conversations and stuff? Because we've got to make it meaningful to people and their lives and challenges they live, because everyone's an expert. I mean, most of you won't realise that in the front row, Rosamond is sitting, who's Ella's mum. Ella tragically lost her life when she was 9, about 10 years ago. And Rosamond's given me permission to talk about Ella and the campaign. Not to use Rosamond or to Ella, because it humanises the crisis in air quality. Because when I say there's around 4,000 deaths a year, that's a number, right? Stats work to a point. When I explain, but for the grace of God, it could be your daughter, your niece, your younger sister, because I know somebody who lost a daughter. I humanise it. I'm not using emotional blackmail, I'm just telling you there are other Ellas whose names you don't know. And so you've got to humanise this. You've got to explain, because people will remember the 41 degrees last summer. Listen, that heatwave wasn't an aberration, that heatwave was predicted. The flash flooding that we've seen, it has happened. These are biblical events, supposed to happen in 1,000 years, happening every other summer. An amazing fact, right? Last summer was the busiest day for the London Fire Brigade any day since the Second World War and the Blitz. Right? And they were busy during the Second World War because they were dealing with fires because of the Luftwaffe, destroying half of London. That's how busy the fire service were last week. So we've got to humanise the consequences of climate change, but also, Chris is right, give hope. The rest of there are opportunities here. Listen, you can breathe cleaner air. If we were speaking in the 50s and you walked here to this meeting, you'd have gone through this great smog because of the power station in the heart of our city. Brave politicians passed the Clean Air Act, got rid of the great smog. If you had this meeting in the 1850s, the stench would have been unbelievable because of the great stink, right? Bazalgette and others, brave politicians in the Victorian time, built these sewers. We've got a great stink, you can't smell this pollution. We've not got a great smog, you can't see it, but it's there. And there's testimony to the fact it's there. But as you've got to flip it around, imagine if our kids didn't have stunted lungs, how great that would be. They could walk and scooter and not worry about air quality. When you turn on the news at night time, you're told about the pollen count, so you don't have the misery of moist eyes the next day because of hay fever. Well, who tells you about a high quality alert because of the air pollution? We're doing that in London now because of Rosamond's lobbying campaign and so forth. So we do have to think about this, both climate change and air pollution, and give hope. And I think the Hackneys, the Putney High Streets, the Londons are really examples of hope. But I tell you this, if, and it's a big if, these climate change delayers, these opportunistic objectors somehow succeed in delaying ULEZ being expanded, imagine how nervous the next mayor is going to be, the next council is going to be, the next member of parliament is going to be, the next member of the assembly is going to be, and so forth and so. That's why we've got to win this battle, and I'm sure we will.
And Chris, what are your thoughts on some of this as well?
Well, I think they're all related in a way because it is around narratives, and we've always got to be confident that, to stay the same, we've got to change in our arguments. So we can't just rest on the fact that the IPCC has now published a report, 4,500 pages, whatever, and this is it, the jargon that's sometimes used from the top, the COP process. Actually, when it came to Net Zero Review, it wasn't just about the recommendations. I said to my team, we're going to have to work. Part one is about creating a new narrative that can confront I'm not just a green Tory, I'm a Tory that believes in economic opportunities, growth, and that we can actually make a difference, and that we can tackle this climate crisis, and that we've got the solutions to be able to do it now, but some of those solutions mean widening our understanding of net zero, so it's not seen as some sort of arcane scientific term, but it relates to the fact that resources we use can also not just demonstrate the importance of recycling, clean water, and improving the environment, actually reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. And when it comes to nature, we had the Net Zero Nature mission in the report, because obviously 30% of our journey towards net zero is recognising the importance of future land use. But also when it comes to nature, and Sadiq talked about the bees and the beavers, and people care about this, and this is part of their own local environments. Everyone thinks in terms of their own narrative around their own life, and nature is an incredibly important part of that. So anything we can do that demonstrates that the climate crisis isn't a distant threat that is happening up in the Arctic or elsewhere in the world, but it's today, here and now in your own locality, as Sadiq said, houses burning down in London last July. Those are powerful messages that help forge a new narrative, but we can never rest on our laurels. That narrative will need to change, it will need to be updated, along with the policies that go with it.
I think, all of us probably could talk about this for a lot longer, but unfortunately we are running out of time. I think if there's a final word from either of you both on some of the questions that we've had, let me know if you want to bring them in now. But I want to just firstly thank, again, our sponsor, Zero Waste Scotland, and also Chris Skidmore and Sadiq Khan tonight for their speeches. Sadiq, do you want to have a quick final word from you as well?
No, can I just echo the point I made during my speech, which is, I need you, Rosamond needs you. We need to make sure that we, mobilise, we're allies here, right? But the next few months are going to be pretty tough. We're going to get you guys over the line, because we are seen, deservedly so, as a world leader when it comes to tackling the climate emergency and fixing the air. And so any help you can give is much appreciated, and I'm sure future generations will also be grateful to the work we're doing now. The time for action is now.
Just to say, I'm leaving Parliament next election, but I will still be focusing very much on delivering our net zero commitments and our commitments to emissions reduction. We're now entering a process in politics, Sadiq will know well, where political parties of all colours will be thinking about those manifesto commitments. And it's so important that we work now to work with all political parties to try to ensure that they make those commitments in those manifesto texts, because that's what the civil service then holds whoever wins power to account. So it's really important now, this period we're about to enter, that we work with all political parties to try to make them make those commitments in their manifestos, because this next general election is going to be the most important when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. Why? Because whoever is elected in autumn 24 will hold the stewardship of whether actually the UK is able to achieve its NDC for 2030, whether the government is going to be able to achieve the electric vehicle mandate in 2030. Net zero is not about 2050 anymore, it is about 2030, and whoever wins the election in 2024 will be held responsible for meeting those 2030 goals.
Thank you both so much. Sadiq Khan,